wrapping up our study of the book of Galatians, this letter that Paul had written to the church in Galatia that we've been studying for about the last month. We've gone through in previous lessons chapters 1 through the beginning of chapter 4, but our quarterly skips ahead a little bit here to get into chapter 6, but I want to recap just briefly what Paul covers in chapters 4 and 5, because I think it will help our understanding of what we're going to read this morning. Obviously, this was a letter, so if you cut out the middle part of it and you jump straight to the end, maybe you won't understand what we're getting to this morning in this passage that they've selected for us here. As we've mentioned, as I've mentioned, and Ronnie and Toby and Andy have mentioned, the problem that Paul was trying to address here with this letter to the Galatians was that after he had planted this church and got these people established in the faith, he went off on his missionary journey to plant other churches, but he heard word back from Galatia that false teachers had come in and they had started teaching that faith in Jesus was not enough for salvation, that the faith that Paul taught was not enough, that these people would also have to observe the Mosaic law and the traditions of the Jewish people. Keep in mind, these are Gentiles. These are non-Jews that Paul had converted. So these people come in, Judaizers they called them, and laid all this extra stuff on their shoulders and were trying to tell them that that was essential to salvation too. So Paul writes this fairly angry letter back to them and says, you've got it all wrong. The law never justified anybody. The law never made anybody holy. Why are you trying this thing? The law's only role, the law's only purpose was to show us how unworthy of a righteous God we are. And to point, it was our schoolmaster, he says at one point, and to point forward to how much we need a Savior. The law's only goal was to help mankind realize how in need of Jesus they were. So he lays out this masterful argument for salvation by faith and not by works. In chapter 4, I find this so interesting. He compares the law of Moses to slavery. As Ronnie taught in his lesson last time, it says you're no longer a servant, but a son. That word that is translated here as servant can also mean slave. Paul goes on to compare the law and Jesus to the wives of Abraham. This is interesting stuff if you want to read it this week in the end of chapter 4. He compares the law to Hagar, that bondwoman, that slave woman that Abraham had Ishmael by, and compares Jesus to Sarah, his wife. She was a free woman, the one that gave birth to Isaac. And Paul points out that the promise that God had made to Abraham was not fulfilled through the slave woman. It was fulfilled through the free woman. So he says, we are not children of slavery. We are children of freedom. He continues this analogy into chapter 5. Chapter 5, verse 13. Brethren, ye have been called unto liberty. Not only use not liberty for an occasion of the flesh, but by love serve one another. I love that. Ye are called unto liberty. You weren't supposed to be a slave. You were supposed to be free. But he says, don't use your freedom to sin. Use your freedom to serve other people. He ends chapter 5 by comparing the works. Interesting that he uses that phrase when we're talking about works versus faith, salvation. He talks about the works of the flesh. Adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, sedition, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings, the works of the flesh. He compares that to the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Fruit, not fruits. All of those things are not individual fruits. That is the fruit of the Spirit all taken together when we embody all of those things. But now we're coming into the home stretch here. Paul's closing this thing up. So let's read what he has to say. Brethren, if a man, this is verse 1, Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such as one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. I'm going to stop right there. Paul has been talking throughout this whole letter to people who thought they needed to follow the law of Moses in order to attain salvation. He says the law of Moses is never going to justify you. But if you want a law to follow, I'm going to give you one. The law of Christ. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Now, theologians have debated what Paul meant by this law of Christ. What is the law of Christ? Is it the Beatitudes that he gave us in the Sermon on the Mount? Is it that new commandment that he gave in John 13? A new commandment, Jesus says, I give unto you, that ye love one another as I have loved you, that ye also love one another. Now, those are things that we should apply to our lives. Those are supposed to be the Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the merciful. That new commandment that we love one another the way Jesus loved us. Those are things that we are supposed to use as a framework to build our Christian lives around. But to say that these rules, these Beatitudes, this new commandment, to say that those rules are the key to salvation, that's just substituting one kind of legalism for another. That's just taking one set of rules and replacing them with another set of rules, because you're still going to be relying on your own righteousness to try to attain salvation. That's not what Paul's talking about here. Here's what I think he really means. Think about this. If the focus was on how righteous we could make ourselves, whether we follow the law of Moses or the commandments that Jesus gave, if that was the real focus of this thing, how much work we could do to make ourselves righteous, that's what those false teachers in Galatia were trying to tell these people. There would be so much less room for grace. Because our attitude then, if we felt that we had made ourselves holy, if we felt like we had cleaned our own selves up, that we had followed the law like that rich young ruler that told Jesus he had followed all the law since his youth. If we felt like our righteousness came from our own works, when we would see somebody that wasn't as holy as we were, we would have no patience for them. We would say, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps and you can do the same thing. We wouldn't have any compassion for them. We wouldn't have any grace for them, because we would say, heck, if I did it, you can do it too. Get your act together. But if we embody this law of Christ that he's talking about, if we acknowledge how unworthy and how in need of a Savior that we are, if we acknowledge that we can't pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, we don't even have boots on our feet when we come to Jesus. If we acknowledge how unworthy we are going to react when we see other people failing with a whole lot more compassion and with a whole lot more grace. Paul gives us a specific example right here. He says, if a brother is overtaken in a fault, he says, you who are spiritual, you who are stronger in the faith, should restore him with a spirit of meekness, meaning gentleness. Jesus was meek. Restore him, act to him like Jesus would have acted to him. But he also urges us to consider, it says, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Now I find that very interesting, because it does two things when we consider ourselves. Not only does it keep us from falling into that same situation that we're trying to help our brother out of, but by considering ourselves, it also keeps that self-righteous tendency tamped down. If we really consider ourselves, we will understand when we see somebody stumbling and falling and overtaken in their faults, we'll acknowledge how just as easily it could have been us. That saying, but for the grace of God go I. That could have just as easily been me down there and needing a hand up. It keeps us from falling into the trap, but it also keeps us from viewing our brother in a judgy, self-righteous way. Bear one another's burdens. Now, that's about like saying, I'll pray for you, brother, and then you never think about it again. This isn't just saying, oh yeah, call me if you need anything. Bear ye one another's burdens. If a burden wasn't heavy, If a burden wasn't hard to carry, it wouldn't be a burden. There's no doubt in my mind that when the people of Galatia read this, see, they were all part of the Roman Empire. And there was a law back then when they heard these words for Paul, when Paul said to bear you one another's burdens. There's no doubt in my mind that when they heard those words, they all thought of the same thing. There was a rule, there was a law back then that a Roman soldier, a centurion, if he came up to you and he had a heavy pack, he could make you carry that pack for him. That was a privilege of being in the Roman army. It didn't matter who you were. It didn't matter if you were busy, had something to do. If a Roman soldier got tired of carrying his pack and came up to you and said, hey buddy, take this. You had to go with it. This is what Jesus was talking about in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, if somebody can script you to go 1 mile, go 2 with them. Go above and beyond. Bear one another's burdens. If they weren't heavy, they wouldn't be burdens. But while we do it, it's easy to do something for somebody and then hold it over their head.
Sure.
He says, as you do it, think about yourself. If a man think himself to be something, verse 3 says, when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let every man prove his own work, and then shall he have a rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. He says if we truly look at ourselves, we won't judge ourselves by other people's failures. It's easy to get out the measuring stick and say, well, I'm not as bad as that person. God must love me more. No, if we truly look at ourselves, we'll realize that we're all just the same, struggling together. Verse 5 says, for every man shall bear his own burden. Now that seems like a direct contradiction to what we just read 3 verses earlier. Bear ye one another's burden, and so fulfill the law of Christ. 3 verses later, every man shall bear his own burden. Now, people would look at that and go, see, the Bible contradicts itself. But here's Paul, a theological genius. I mean, this man was thinking on another level. God had blessed him with an intellect and an understanding of God's Word like we haven't seen before or since. Why would he make such a simple error here? I think it's like 4 sentences later. Why would he contradict himself in that short a space? He knew what he was doing here. He wouldn't have built this beautiful argument for salvation by faith and then mess it up right at the end with something this silly. I think if we consider how it would have been read by that Galatian church, it would have made a little bit more sense to them. The word in verse 2 that gets translated here in the King James as burden is a Greek word, bare. It's a negative word. It's used to mean grief and sorrow, a weight, a burden. But the word that's translated in verse 5 was originally fortion. You know where else it shows up? When Jesus says, my burden is easy. My yoke is light. This word that's used in verse 5, it's just a word for cargo. Like what's carried in a ship. When Luke writes about the ship that Paul was on when he was traveling, they got in that great storm, and he talks about how they had to throw the cargo over. This is the word, the word in verse 5. This is the one that he uses. A ship doesn't mind to carry cargo. That's what a ship does. It's a neutral word. There are some things that we all have to carry. There are some things that we all have to do for ourselves. Like Barbara said this morning, you can't get saved for anybody else. You can't serve God for anybody else. You can't meet somebody else's family obligations. You can't do the work that God has called. You can't do the work that God has called somebody else to do. There are things, there's cargo that we all have to carry. That's not a burden. That's not a grief. That's not an undue weight. That's just life. That's just something that God expects from us, rather. But when it comes to those things that are too heavy, when it comes to those things that burden people down in grief and sorrow, we're not supposed to allow our brethren to carry those things alone. That's what he's talking about when he says for us to bear one another's, the heavy, the grievous burdens, the ones that'll smash you down and keep you from moving forward. That's what we're supposed to help people carry. I think this gets to the heart of Paul's whole letter. As I said in chapter 5, he says, brethren, you've been called to liberty. But don't use your liberty as an excuse to sin. Use it in love to serve one another. Bear one another's burdens. The law of Moses, as Paul lays out here so beautifully, was slavery. You know, in Jewish law, no doubt you've heard about this. If you had gone bankrupt, if you had lost everything you had one way to make sure there was still food on your table. You could join yourself to somebody else. You could sell yourself into slavery. We had sold ourselves into slavery to sin. And you know what? The longer we tried to justify ourselves, the more and more the debt, the higher and higher our debt got. The less and less of a chance it ever got for us that we were going to escape that slavery. It reminds me of Jacob working for Laban. Spent 7 years and got the daughter that he didn't want. And he's like, Laban was like, if you want the one you got, it's going to be 7 more years. The terms of our slavery just got longer and longer. But the law of Christ is the total opposite. It's not slavery. This law is freedom. As I was preparing this lesson, it got me to thinking. In the news, no doubt you heard this week that eventually they're going to replace Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill with Harriet Tubman. And I got to thinking about Harriet Tubman. She lived 27 years as a slave. She was born into slavery. But one morning she said to one of her friends, she said this later in life, she told her friend, she said, I'll meet you in the morning. I'm bound for the promised land. She escaped by the Underground Railroad into freedom. See, when we brought African slaves over here, those slaveholders in the South thought they were going to... They came over with all these pagan beliefs and witchcraft and stuff. And the slaveholders said, we need to get rid of that stuff. We want to make them, subject to us. We want to make them meek and mild. So here's what we'll do. We'll teach them Christianity. Big mistake. Because let me tell you what happens when you give people without hope Christianity. Let me tell you what happens when, as Jesus told the disciples of John the Baptist, the poor have the gospel preached to them. Let me tell you what happens when you introduce people to a Savior that says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captive, and the recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them which are bruised. Let me tell you what happens when you give that to people who don't have hope. They take it to heart. Harriet Tubman told her friend, I'm bound for the promised land. She made her way through the Underground Railroad back up to Pennsylvania where she was free. She said, when I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. But you know what? We couldn't blame her for living out the rest of her days in that glorious freedom. She had suffered trauma that you and I could never understand. We could not blame her if she had wanted to live out the rest of her life content in that freedom. But for Harriet, her freedom would never be enough as long as she knew there were other people still down south that were in slavery.
Bearing a burden.
She said, my father, my mother, my brothers and sisters, my friends are still in slavery, but I was free. And they should be free. So she starts working odd jobs. She starts saving up her money. And eventually, over a course of 11 years, she makes 13 trips back down into enemy territory and rescues 70 slaves. Now, this was during the time that Congress had passed something called the Fugitive Slave Act. That means that even though she had made it to freedom, if she had been caught, she would have been sent straight back to the plantation that she had come off of, where her master could have whipped her, could have killed her, could have worked her until she died of exhaustion. Slaves were property. They were not people. Her master was free to do whatever she wanted. But she wanted freedom for her fellow slaves so bad that she took that chance and went back down there. And you know what? Harriet was was a mighty woman of God. You can read her autobiography. She trusted Jesus for every step that she took. That was what she credits her work for. She said God kept her safe through all those things. You know what? In 11 years, in 13 trips, not Herod and not a single one of the 70 slaves that she delivered into freedom were ever caught. And she gave God the glory for all of that. Now, reading what Paul says here, where he compares the law of Moses, where he compares sin to slavery, and he compares Jesus to freedom. I think if we are truly set free, we'll be like Harriet Tubman. Our freedom will not be enough. We will want to use our freedom, as Paul says in chapter 5, to make sure other people get set free too. Yeah. People say, well, I serve the Lord at the house. And that's fine. You can do it. You could also wash your socks in the dishwasher. But that's not what it's made for. I tried using anybody ever tried using a wand mixer to make mashed potatoes? It'll work. You're supposed to use beaters. I got home, I thought I was going to do something so nice one time. I made Whitney mashed potatoes for dinner. And she said, what did you use to make these mashed potatoes? I said, I used the wand blender. It was like book paste. I didn't use the right tool. You can serve Jesus at home, but that's not how this thing is supposed to work. It's always supposed to be part of a community. Bear ye one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Lifting other people's burdens isn't easy. It's like it wasn't convenient. It wasn't easy. It wasn't safe for Harriet Tubman to run those 13 missions back into enemy territory. No doubt sometimes she must have felt like it was a hopeless case. And sometimes when we're trying to help other people through their burdens, when we're trying to restore those that are overtaken in faults, it can be frustrating. It can be tempting to give up. It can seem hopeless. Paul knew that. Paul knew that better than anybody. That's why he had to write these kind of letters. He was constantly, he compares giving birth to this Galatian church like a woman in childbirth. He knew how difficult it was to help other people in the faith. But he ends this passage of Scripture here with some encouragement. He said, let us not be weary in well-doing. Don't get tired doing the right thing. For in due season we shall reap if we faint not. As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially unto them which are of the household of faith. It ain't easy, but as Paul says, it's going to be worth it.
Yeah, amen.